Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, and today we'll be looking at three different commander decks brought to you by Kybor. Thank you so much for supporting the channel, Kybor. It really means a lot. And the first one we're going to be looking at is a Tom Bombadil Saga Tokens deck. I've gotten a lot of requests for Tom Bombadil. I think it makes a lot of sense. It is a new commander, 5 colors, and allows you to build Saga Tribal. I think these are all things people really like. And so hopefully this specific build, which is a lot more towards tokens and token generation, can still be of interest for other people who have created their own Tom Bombadil decks as directions to go in. Um, and I'm going to make some suggestions that maybe can fit into a lot of Tom Bombadil decks and not just this specific one. Kybor has sent us a very collection of very specific questions, which I will go through as we go through the deck. But I really appreciate it. Having specific questions makes this process very smooth. So before we get any further, as always, the deck list will be in the video description below. I highly recommend you open it up and take a look. It's always really, really helpful to look at other people's decks, especially if you want to build a Tom Bombadil deck. I think it is really useful to see what other people are playing, and sometimes it can help, something like a mana base can be really a lot easier when you have something to work off of. So using someone else's mana base as a jumping off point can be really, really helpful, especially in 5 colors. So who is Tom Bombadil? Why are we using them? And what's the plan of the deck? Well, Tom Bombadil is a 5-color god bard. Yeah, that's a 4/4 and says as long as there's 4 or more lore counters among sagas you control, Tom Bombadil has hexproof and indestructible. I think that's pretty cool, but at the same time, we're really using Tom for his second ability, which says, when a final chapter ability of a saga you control resolves, reveal cards onto the top of your library until you reveal a saga card, put the card onto the battlefield and the rest in the bottom in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, what this basically means is that every time one of your sagas ends, you get the next saga out of your deck onto the battlefield, but only once a turn. Now, I've seen a lot of people talking about this as Cascade. It's not exactly Cascade, because you don't have to go downwards in mana cost as Cascade works. And in fact, a lot of the time, you want to go into the opposite direction. You want to play your low mana sagas, and you want them to pull out higher mana sagas. Obviously, the dream would be for a 3 mana saga to pull out your 7 mana saga, but that's not always going to be the case. Now, a big thing about this deck, especially with Tom, is that we have to think about timing. Timing is incredibly important because you can not only can you only get one saga per turn, like one saga cascade per turn, but also Tom Bombadil has to be on the battlefield to see that happening, right? Now, to an extent, usually this isn't a problem. When sagas are about to go off, they usually have a lot of counters. If you have more than one saga, Tom Bombadil getting hexproof and indestructible is a way to keep him on board from most threats. But, and this is a pretty big but, I wouldn't 100% rely on that. This is probably effective in lower power, but as the power level gets higher, I would suggest that that line of text is less important than you would think it is. If your opponents really want to get rid of Tom, there's a lot of ways they can do that. Namely, I think the most often way you're going to, like higher powered tables are going to stop Tom Bombadil is by countering him and not letting him touch the battlefield in the first place. Otherwise, after the first cascade trigger, when the cascade trigger will happen when the final ability resolves, which means you've lost all the counters that are on the saga, that would be probably a time that Tom Bombadil will lose hexproof and indestructible and be vulnerable to removal. Now, granted, that's probably at the start of your turn, so you can hold up counter magic, but it is still important to take note of. All right, so looking at this deck and how it works, we're going to take a moment to look at the curve as we always do. The curve here is really nice. It goes up to 9, but 9 is Blasphemous Act, so that's not a problem. We've got 3 at 7, 3 at 6. Sorry, it always says 2 and then 1, and I get confused. And we'll probably talk a bit about these cards when we have a chance, but otherwise, the deck is really well built mana-wise. Something to note, this is something I mention every now and then that I always think is worth mentioning. We should always be a little careful about the mana, the CMC that matches our commander. So in this deck, it would be 5 mana. So whether we mean it to or not, these cards all compete with Tom Bombadil as, the play of the turn. And when we think a little practically, because when we think of casting spells and the number of spells we can cast, at a certain point, it becomes unwieldy to cast multiple spells of high mana cost. So to be able to cast Tom Bombadil and one of these really powerful spells, we're looking at 10 mana. So it's important to remember that these cards are like they're an or, they're not an and. And so we can be a little more critical on them than any other cards of CMCs because of that competition that it brings in. So let's go up here and let's see the first. I'm trying to think if I want to start with the questions or I want to point out a few cards. What I think I want to do is I want to point out a few cards that I think stand out as things that I want to be critical of. And then after which we're going to look at Kyber's questions so that we have some room for inclusions or opinions. All right. So the ones that stand out to me are the first thought is we have Replenish, Open the Vaults, and Eerie Ultimatum. These 3 cards mainly do very similar things where we want to return our entire, like all of our sagas from the graveyard to the battlefield. Now, Eerie Ultimatum has the benefit of bringing back our fetch lands and some of our creatures that might have died, and Open the Vaults also brings artifacts, which we are actually on a very low amount, so it is something worth considering. And it also brings all players, not just yours. And Replenish is just all enchantment cards from your graveyard. So looking at these 3, I am much more impressed by Replenish. The other 2 feel like they're going to wait in your hand a lot more. Eerie Ultimatum specifically obviously has a very, very restrictive mana cost, but also just generally in the sense that Eerie Ultimatum is not a card you want to cast with 2 or 3, permanents in your graveyard. Fetch lands aside, even with fetch lands, like the ramp is good, but this is a card, because of its 7 mana, it's such an investment. You really want to be getting, 5, 6 cards back, and it would be really good if the majority were sagas, right? And that's something you have to think about whenever Eerie Ultimatum. Open the Vaults, likewise, you want to be getting more cards than your opponents. Now, as we know, enchantments are generally lower, you see them less frequently in most commander decks, unless there's a dedicated enchantment deck. And to an extent, artifacts are like that, but a little more common because of mana rocks, which tend not to go to the graveyard. But at higher levels of play, the enchantments that you would be returning, if they were removed off the board, are really, really good. So think of the enchantments your opponents might be playing that had to have been removed. So I'm thinking Mystic Remora, I'm thinking Rhystic Study, I'm thinking Smothering Tide, I'm thinking Necropotence. At certain levels, we could talk about Blood Moon, Back to Basics, right? These are really, really powerful cards that this deck itself needs to be able to deal with, because when your opponents... Now, sorry, I just need a second to see. Is Tom Bombadil Cascade? You may put it on the battlefield. Okay, it's not a cast. But those other cards, like Rhystic Study is really strong against this deck because this deck really wants to play on curve constantly, and losing mana here and there can be very costly. In the same way that this deck is also really vulnerable, obviously, to Blood Moon, obviously to Back to Basics. An opponent that has resolved Necropotence and you can't deal with it can be really tricky. So I'm on Replenish, sorry. Open the Vaults has this kind of game plan that you need to be able to hold out on it because it's 6 mana and you want to get I would say at least 3 of your sagas back for it to be worth it. But then you have to add in the cards you might be returning for your opponents. So that kind of skews it even further. And I'm starting to think, well, you better be getting 4 to 5 sagas, and they better be good enough to not be put back by what your opponents, like can grab. If they grab a lot of cards that are like even one really good card makes open the vaults kind of a problem to deal with. I also think before we go to replenish, something that's worth noting is that this deck doesn't really have the means to naturally bin your enchantments, so that the main mechanic for you to get these enchantments into the graveyard is to cast them and have them fully resolve and go to the graveyard. Um, I don't I don't think this is an ideal way. Like it's like thinking about making a reanimator deck where the main way to reanimate your cards, like to put them in the graveyard, is that you had to have cast them first and they had to have died, right? It's not an ideal way to have this mechanic working. So, with that in mind, let's look at the last one. The last one we're looking at is replenish, and replenish, honestly, I have no problems with it. Much like that example with reanimation spells, sometimes you'll see like reanimate in just mono black decks that aren't reanimator spells. I think replenish has the same power here. It's 4 mana, so at that point, I'm okay with you getting 1 or 2 sagas back for it. 4 mana to like bring back um, Binding of the Old Gods, I think is absolutely worth it. I think that is a great, great thing to do because that's just the same cost of Binding of the Old Gods. Once again, you get a really good effect off. And then if you think you can get like Binding of the Old Gods and like honestly, any of these, any of the 3 mana ones, now you're like you're gaining quite a bit of advantage. So replenish, I really really like, and the other two I don't like as much. I think they should be considered to be cut because I think most of the time you're not going to be happy to draw them outside of very specific circumstances. The other card like this I'm noticing, which also is in our 5 mana slot, is Eldrazi Monument. I really like Eldrazi Monument, but not in a deck like this. Eldrazi Monument is really, really strong when you are creating a large amount of tokens where each individual token isn't particularly good. The problem here is that this deck instead creates a variety of tokens. Some of them are big, some of them are small, and some of them come out easier than others. Even if we have our ability to double the amount of tokens coming out, I think the sacrifice per turn is going to be very meaningful. Something like There and Back Again creates 1 dragon token. Now, granted, it's very happy to be sacrificed, but I think it's important to consider that since the other cards you're playing, the ones that aren't specific token producers, are valuable to you, you don't want to be sacrificing idle creatures here and there when your token producers are not online. I can see the plus side. Like this is a card that's really strong when your deck is doing the thing that you want it to be doing. You're ahead. You've got a huge board. All of your tokens now have flying and indestructible, and +1/+1. I think that's great, but I don't think that's always going to be the case. And much like Eerie Ultimatum, when you're not set up for it, this is the kind of card that rots in your hand, right? If you get your more utility, your non-token generating sagas, you're going to be quite behind while Eldrazi Monument is in your hand because you'll be looking at like your Sanctum Weaver and I don't know, your Cetacean Champion on the board and being like, I do not want to cast Eldrazi Monument because I would like to keep my creatures. So that's another card that I think kind of sticks out to me. Um, there's a few here. Now, I don't want to be too strict on the sagas. It's the whole fun of the deck, but we could be strict on a few of them. I'm going to leave that up to you because they're all of appropriate power level. I think the one that stands out to me is Behold the Unspeakable. Once again, it's at that 5 mana slot, so I already don't like that it like competes with their commander. It doesn't create any tokens. Um, its effect is negligible. The -2/-0 is basically a fog for a turn cycle, which can be either really, really good or meaningless. And since it's not actually a complete fog, it's a -2 power. There's a point in the board where it is just meaningless, where you're looking across the board and someone has, an army of 5/5s. Yeah, they're 3/3s now, and that's not nothing, but it's still like we haven't really changed the math that badly. The second ability only, you know, only sometimes triggers really powerfully. It's fine. 5 mana to do the second effect isn't a great deal, but at the same time, it's not bad. And then when it transforms, it's not where the deck wants to be, right? The Vision of the Unspeakable is just for a different deck. It just doesn't really belong here. So that one kind of sticks out at me as something that I wouldn't really want to play. And though this is not a saga, it's once again at our 5 mana. Cathar's Crusade is a tricky card. um, I always say, like, I own this card and I like playing this card, but you have to commit to this card, right? What I mean by that is that one, um, Cathar's Crusade doesn't do a lot when you're playing one creature per turn, which this deck sometimes does. Sometimes your sagas line up so that you're only getting one token or two tokens a turn, and Cathar's Crusade is just okay then. Cathar's Crusade is really, really good on the turn. You have, let's say, Archon of Sun's Grace and Sanctum Weaver, and you are just chaining, and let's say one of your draws, so like Citizen Champion again, and you are just chaining saga after saga. You're just casting a bunch of small ones, and you get, let's say, 4 or 5 enter the battlefield triggers in one turn, so that your entire board gets +4/+4 in one turn and attacks. That's the real power of Cathar's Crusade. That's when it really shines. Outside of that, it kind of just is there. It's just kind of every time you once a turn put a +1/+1 counter on all except for your newest creature, and then it gets to a point where the text just reads one of your opponents is about to wipe the board. And for 5 mana, I don't think that's this isn't the kind of deck that can really, really exploit that. So I'm a little less interested of Cathar's Crusade here. I also want to point out that Cathar's Crusade is really annoying to play with in paper. This is a mileage may vary kind of thing. Some people this doesn't bother. This really bothers me, and I like the card. I will sit there and I will put like 6 tokens in and not at the same time, and I will look at my opponents and I will just try to convince them that they should concede so I don't have to do the math. And often they use the correct decision of telling me, no, Cursed, you can't do that. So this is dependent on the player, but it can be tricky to make this card work, like literally. All right, I think those are the ones that like very much so stand out. Once again, some of these questions, some of these might be a little specific to play group. Something like Eldest Reborn can be really, really good or just okay, and it's going to depend on your play group. I recommend that if you're going to be looking at these, I'm going to recommend that you look mainly at the 5 mana ones, which are some of the strongest ones, but that is where I would start my analysis because once again, it competes with our commander. All right, so let us look at Kybur's questions and see if we can answer any of them. So the first question is there any token generating cards that we're missing that we can put in? I have a few, but they're kind of not what you would expect, I might say. So the first one I think that's really, really easy is the Birth of Meletis. This is a saga I noticed that you were missing. I think it's interesting. I really like the ability of a Birth of Meletis to get you a basic planes. I don't know how many you're playing. I assume just the one. Uh, yeah, just the one. So there is a limit to how good this is. It's not good playing it more than once, but it's not nothing. The ability to put a land in your hand in such a land heavy, like such a mana hungry deck is not nothing. The fact that it creates an 0/4 token, it's not great. It does create a token, and then gaining 2 life is meaningless. So this is just a mid card. Why am I suggesting it? Well, I think one of the things is if you are ramping, if you are trying to set up, the cascades, Birth of Meletis is a particularly good one. So let's see. This is turn 2, this is turn 3, this is turn 4. So if you ramp one, you need to ramp 2 times, right? You need to be able to play Tom Bombadil on turn 3. So turn 1, you play Birds of Paradise. Turn 2, you play this, and then if you play another ramp card, right, that puts you 2 ahead, which means on turn 3, after creating a wall, you can play Tom Bombadil. Turn 5, it triggers and you get your first cascade. Is that that different from putting a 3 mana on turn 2? Maybe not, but it is more regular. I don't know. I'm thinking about it and I am thinking it's kind of medium. The fact that it's a 2 mana saga that triggers your enchantresses is not nothing, but I just wanted to include this in because it seemed a little missing, and I wanted to address it a little bit. All right, let's get to the cards proper that I'd like to put in. Well, the thing is, I want to put in tokens, but I want to put in tokens not of creatures. I want to put in tokens of the sagas, if possible. Now, these tokens won't be able to attack, but these are tokens that we're going to be able to get advantage from, and ideally, all the sagas that produce tokens themselves are prime candidates for that. So, for example, Tamio the Completed Sage is our 5 mana completed planeswalker, and her -X allows us to exile sagas from our graveyard to get a copy of it. Now, this kind of competes with cards like Replenish, but as just a one-off getting a card back, this is pretty reasonable. If you pay the full 5 mana, you can immediately get a 5 mana saga back, albeit you lose Tamio. If you're willing to pay less mana, you can get a smaller saga back, or you can pay the full 5, use -3 or -4, and keep Tamio. But obviously, the really nice thing about this is that it works really well with your token doublers, because then you are able to create 2 sagas of a saga of your choice. And getting, for example, 2 History of Benalias can be really, really good because that represents, if you have Mondrak out, let's just say, or let's say any of your token doublers, and you create a token copy of History of Benalia. So 1 History of Benalia creates 4, so you are getting 8 2/2s out of that cast. And then on the final trigger, you are getting +4/+2 across those 8 2/2s. That's not nothing. And I would say that's maybe one of the middle cards. If you were to get one of the stronger ones, where is our Oath of Errol? Oath of Errol as a token that comes into play with a token doubler represents an entire massive army, right? That represents, I'm going to do the math here. Well, so that's 8 1/1s and 8 2/2s, right? That is a fantastic army. With something like that, I won't even complain about Cathar's Crusade. I think that's great. So Tamio represents this, and the next 2 as well. Replication Technique is a really, really interesting one, because, once again, this is a permanent that we're going to make a copy of, and so it doesn't have to be the sagas, but it can be. It can also be your creatures, depending on the creature, but then we have Demonstrate. I think Demonstrate is one of those really, really powerful abilities because you're going to pick the opponent that gets the least amount of benefit from this ability. And you can even use politics to kind of like work with an opponent. So say, like I'll let you get a copy of this card in exchange. Can you deal with this? And even then, you are by far getting the advantage. The floor of this card is to get 2 for 5 mana, get 2 copies of any permanent. That's really, really good. Um, Probably not good enough to hit lands with this. Maybe if you're desperate, you can get two token copies of a Triome or something to fix your mana, but probably not. But any of your creatures, any of your sagas, you're going to be really happy to get multiple copies of. Especially the bigger sagas, um, you're going to have a really good time. I think it's funny. I'm now realizing I've suggested two 5 mana cards after being very critical about including 5 mana cards in. Uh, yeah, well, I guess there's not much I can say about that. But I think replication technique is very, very good. And then our final one is extravagant replication at 6 mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of another target non-land permanent you control. This one is probably weaker because you have to wait an entire turn cycle to get it. But once again, I think I think because it's on upkeep, so your sagas haven't gone off, right? You can have a saga that's on ready to go to its last chapter, and then play extravagant replication. The turn cycle happens, and replication can make a copy of that saga before it leaves play. So there is a natural benefit of the timing here, but also you know, once again, when we think of the token doublers, there is a really, really high chance that you are making multiple copies of any saga, any creature that you want. And I think that's really, really good. There is all of these cards do that I've mentioned have the problem that if you do not have cards in play to copy that are worthwhile, or or with Tameo in the graveyard, they don't really do anything, and that is worth considering. But the sheer number of sagas you have, I think it's definitely worth, you know, it's definitely worth considering playing these cards. I would say quite a bit. I think these cards would be really, really strong. Uh, I would say Extravagant Replication is the weakest of the three I've shown so far, with Replication Technique being the strongest. Tameo is just fine. Tameo, I feel like, is just going to vary on strength. I have one more to suggest, but this card isn't out yet. So this one will have to be on your mind. But Onyxia, Hand of Erebos, is a card that I definitely want to make into a commander, mainly because I love the color combination and that art is fantastic. She's a demigod, and the main text we care about is when she enters the battlefield or attacks. So she's like a titan, which I think is pretty funny in context. You exile a non-aura enchantment from your graveyard, and you create a token copy of the card, except for it's a 3/3 black zombie. So here's the thing. Um, Getting your tokens back once a turn cycle, like when she ETBs and then on each attack, pretty good. Like getting a saga back each time is pretty good. Is it the best because they come back as 3/3s? I don't know. It's going to be, it's a tricky thing. I definitely like her a lot because she represents the immediate and then once a turn, which makes her better, in my opinion, than extravagant replication. It is pulling them out of your graveyard permanently, so there is a bit of a problem there. And the fact that they're creatures makes them vulnerable to removal. But once again, the floor is fine, I think. I think you're pretty happy casting her and just getting back, once again, I'm just going to use History of Benalia here. You're pretty happy to get History of Benalia. You're pretty happy to get any of your like first or Ironian games. Like it's not crazy good, but if it's left on the field, you're just going to enjoy a lot of counters coming in. If you're able to do this with like, the bigger ones of Cruelty of Gix, all of a sudden you can read ahead, tutor a card, and then if we get through the turn cycle, you get a really nice benefit. I think that's really, really good too. I think the tension of it, of the fact that she herself will exile the cards, I think that's negligible. I think the fact that she is an enchantment herself allows for some interesting deck building. So I think she exists in a really good space, and she's definitely the kind of card that I would include in a deck like this. She makes tokens, she cares about your sagas. You don't even mind that the creatures are going to die eventually because your sagas were going to die eventually too. It does make you more weak to board clears, but you're a token deck, so I don't think that's a problem. these are the suggestions that I have. They may be unexpected suggestions. I didn't think if I just looked through sagas, I would find a saga that produces tokens that you hadn't thought about. This was the direction I wanted to go in. And I think these cards work really, really well as support for your main game plan. So let's take a look at this. The next question is my package of making my tokens strong enough to win the game look good? This is a difficult question. I think this is a regular question that a lot of Commander players have. Is this plan strong enough? Well, the answer is always going to be, it depends, right? Is this plan feasible? Yes, I think this is a feasible plan. The plan is going to be to play out your sagas, preferably the ones that create enchantments, build your board forward, play out cards that encourage more enchantments or more tokens, and move forward that way. I think that's a sound game plan. I think also the backup of just playing your sagas out and using Tom Bombadil as intended is also really, really good. That being said, is it the strongest strategy? No, but I think that's fine, right? This is the kind of deck that will probably lose against other combo decks because your collection of interaction is rather low. Counterspell, Cyclonic Rift, Mana Drain, Fierce Guardianship, and Teferi's Protection, though very strong cards, are not an infinite supply of defensive cards. You won't be able to deal with every problem. You're going to be leaning on your other opponents, to kind of hold down other combo decks. And I think that's fine. Not every deck can do everything, and this isn't the kind of deck that wants to do everything, right? You are a proactive, aggressive deck. You are the one that is causing problems that other people have to solve. I don't think there is a way to power up that plan to a point beyond that. Like there's not a collection of sagas that are just plain strong enough for you to immediately win the game in certain circumstances, right? Unless you wanted to put Demonic Consultation and Thassa's Oracle, there will be a ceiling on this deck. And I think that's fine. I think this will operate really, really well underneath that ceiling. You have a lot of benefit to playing a lot of very good cards that incidentally work really well together. A deck that gets to play Binding of the Old Gods, maybe reanimate it, maybe create a token copy of it. Like, this card by itself is a good commander playable Magic card. And the fact that it works well with your commander and a number of other cards is a testament to the base strength and function of the deck. So I do think your package of tokens looks good enough to win the game. The third question that was asked, are there better ways to ramp into my first saga / Tom Bombadil? They really want to have turn 1 and 2 ramp so they can play their first saga turn 3 and then Bombadil turn 4 so I can start the Cascade turn 5. So there's not a lot of remaining options. So Birds of Paradise, Delighted Halfling, Ignoble Hierarch, Noble Hierarch are a good start. After which I want to put in Utopia Sprawl. Utopia Sprawl is fantastic for adding one additional color early on. It's also really nice that it is not a creature, so it's harder to interact with. Also, not as strong, but still strong, is Wild Growth, with Wild Growth's caveat being it can only add green mana. I think these two can be added in very, very easily. And then after which, if you wanted to add more cards, you could start looking at the mana dorks that do not produce multiple colors. Llanowar Elves. You could, you know what? You could actually go, I would say, who's our 1/2? Power 1, toughness 2, elf. Deathrite Shaman. I had to start looking for it in order to remember what it was. You can definitely play Deathrite Shaman here. I think Deathrite Shaman with your number of fetches, I'm assuming you're playing against opponents that also have fetch lands. If so, Deathrite Shaman is probably the first mana dork I would play. And in fact, I would probably play him before the Hierarchs, just because of the ceiling of this card. This is a very, very good card. Um, in a deck like this, you don't really care about the other two abilities, but its ability to ramp you as long as you have fetch lands, which you have a lot of fetch lands, is really, really good. So I would look in that order, after which I would look at, our other one mana creatures with the knowledge that as we add one mana creatures, our deck gets more susceptible to removal, more susceptible to hate. You end up keeping hands that are overall weaker without the mana dork in it. And so if your opponent lightning bolts your mana dork, which does happen in this format, you end up being rather behind because you've built a hand over around that mana dork. So it's worth considering. I don't think I would go too much further than that. I think you could easily put like three, like I could put Deathrite Shaman, you could put in Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth, and I think you'd be pretty happy with those. Anything more than that, I think it's probably overkill. Like the Wild Growth and the Utopia Sprawl are nice because they themselves are enchantments, so therefore they work with some of your enchantresses, so they're not always dead draws. But at a certain point, you're going to be, reducing the overall strength of your deck in because you are trying to make more explosive starts without them being game winning. So, there will be situations where you cascade into the first Ionian games or History of Benalia, which are cards that are for your strategy, but are not the same power level as cascading into, the Kiora Best the Sea God, right? They're just different levels of power. And so we have to be aware that when we increase the speed, that what we're speeding into has to have what would we call it? An equivalent level of power. Now, the last main question that Keyboard is asking is about the flip Praetors and whether or not they should go in. So, I think I think they're tricky. I think including the collection in is probably a trap. You already know that Urabrask isn't the strongest. I think I think they should be, there's two ways to include them. You can include them for their front side, or you can include them for their back side. On their front side, Shieldred is probably the strongest because it is removal and it affects the whole board. It is a clean 3-for-1 all of the time, especially since it hits non-tokens. That's really, really nice. On the backside, Jin Gataxias is probably the stronger one. However, I don't know how reasonably you can trigger Jin Gataxias. A lot of your card draw is a little dependent on Enchantress based mainly, and so it's tough for you to hit that 7 cards unless you're already in the lead. So I don't know if this is the kind of deck that Jin Cataxius wants. Elshnorn is interesting. I think it's fine. She would be good, but you really have to see how often she flips. Her flip side is obviously probably reliably the strongest ones because it works in your deck. Um, but you lose your sagas on number 3. It's tough. It's tough. I think the safest one is Shieldred. Shieldred by herself is just a great card. And on the flip side, I love this art, by the way. I hope this is the art you got. I absolutely love it. I just opened Shieldred in a pack. And unfortunately, it was the regular art, and I am heartbroken. But if you can get to the true scriptures, I think you're in a really, really good place. It's still quite a mana investment. I believe it is 10 mana total to do so, because ideally you want to cast Shieldred and immediately flip it. And it's worth considering there's 3 black in that, but it is really reasonable to expect one of your opponents to have 8 cards in their graveyard, and I think Shieldred's backside does, which is a funny sentence to say out loud, does the most in general for the deck, right? it gives you a lot of, it gives you a control aspect that the deck otherwise is lacking, where you play this side of the saga and all of a sudden you're able to pressure your opponent's boards, you're able to pressure their hands, and then the final pressure that your opponents have to deal with this before it gets to the Rise of the Dark Realms text, because if it does, you're probably gaining a ridiculous amount of card advantage and won't be able to be stopped at that point. So at this moment, I would say just Shieldred. For the sake of it, I will really briefly look at Vorinclex isn't even there. Okay, so I'm gonna look at him anyways. Uh, I know you spoke, but I don't. I personally don't remember what it does. 2 forests, put it in your hand. Then 8 mana, you flip it. Mill 10, 2 creatures, 7+1. Yeah, that's fair. You don't want this because you are not a creature deck. Yeah. So to answer that question, I think Shieldred would be the answer here. All right, this has gone on for a bit long. I hope this helps. I think the deck itself is really, really strong. If there's one more thing I can talk about is maybe a deck like this would benefit from having just a little bit of, traditional blue card draw. You are in the colors for Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora, and I think they're pretty free to play in this deck to have some card draw that isn't tied to enchantments. Even though, actually, when I say it out loud, it is tied to enchantments, but I meant more like in response to playing more enchantments. Rhystic Study can be played and most likely will get you extra cards. Similarly, I think you could probably get away with playing Smothering Tithe with almost no downside. Um, these are just good cards that can help support this deck in a meaningful way so that if your other game plans aren't working out, you can lean on the relative strength of these cards to get ahead. But yeah, I hope this deck assist was helpful to you. I would love to see the next draft of your deck. And for any draft, as everyone knows, there is a link in the video description below. And if you too would like to skip the line and bring your deck assist to the next one on the list, there is a link there for that as well. Once again, thank you, Quibor, for supporting the channel, and I am excited to see the next one. All right, good luck.